So at the risk of honestly just jumping right in, this last Tuesday, myself, Rafa, John Root, Chase Adams, and Eric, we all went to this kind of pastoral gathering. There's 14 guys in Pella who desire to be pastors, and so there's things that I'll bring them to and all that. And it was with a guy named Kent Hughes who had been in ministry for about 45 years. And the premise of the entire day was God's strength in our weakness. And as I was listening to him talk, it was hard for me not to navigate this text in real time. And I'm not somebody who labels a sermon or anything like that. It's just not how I operate. When you go to YouTube or whatever, you look at the sermon, you're going to see it's titled Genesis 12, 13, and 14. That's it, right? But if I was to title this text and what we're going through in this time of the Word, again, I think the best is the fragility of the one who receives the promise and the strength of the one who gives it. I think that would be the premise of what we're trying to navigate right now. So for us to be able to do this, here's what I want to do. I want to look at these 3 chapters through 5 different stories, okay? As we look through these 5 stories, we're going to see how they tie together in some ways. And then at the end, we're going to talk about the importance of the 5th story. But what I want us to see is, on one side, 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verse 11 tells us that the stories that we see in the Old Testament, predominantly for the Israelites, are for examples for us, that we know that these are given by way of examples. We can see this, that the heroes of the faith in Hebrews 11, they're examples for us. But at the same time, we were left with, at the end of chapter 11 in Genesis, that this big God, the God of the nations, has a plan. And so I don't want to leave the big macro level of what's going on. So we'll look at the individual stories, but the bigger point at hand is, what is God doing in all 3 of these chapters together in light of what we saw in chapter 11? God, there's brokenness. What's the plan? The nations are separated. What's the plan? And he gave us a little bit of insight in the genealogies of chapter 11. And so Pastor Frank unpacked the first section of chapter 12 for us. I'm just going to bring to remembrance the first 5 verses, and it'll make sense here why. Here's our first story. First story is this. Now the Lord said to Abram, "Go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed." This is traditionally known as the Abrahamic blessing. Notice, if you can, 7 things. This starts the whole first story. 7 things. Number 1, Abram's going to be a great nation. 2, God is going to bless him. 3, he's going to make his name great. Number 4, he will be a blessing. Number 5, anyone who blesses him will be blessed. It carries over. Number 6, anyone who dishonors or curses him will be cursed. And then number 7, all the families of the earth will be blessed. And there it is. There's the answer. God, what's the plan for the nations? His answer is Abram, who will be Abraham. That's my plan. So this is the first story, and we know Abraham leaves, and it involves of this blessing and being a blessing to the nation's land and people and riches. And so we'll continue to read the story as it goes on. But verses 4 and 5 are helpful for us today. It says this. So Abram went as the Lord had told him, and Lot went with him. Abram was 75 years old when he had departed from Haran. And Abram took Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his brother's son, and all their possessions that they had gathered, and the people they had acquired in Haran, and they set out to go to the land of Canaan, which is Canaan is the promised land. So this is the direction that they're going. Notice they bring all of their stuff and all of the people. Now, the reason I read verses 4 and 5, though, is because it mentions 2 people, Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his nephew. Now, we need to know them because the next 3 stories we're going to tell right now involve Sarai, his wife, and Lot, his nephew. So story 1 is God calls Abraham to leave his land, and he does, and he gives him all this blessing. Story 1. Story 2 now is going to focus on Abram and his wife Sarai. So this is where we pick it up in verse 10. Now, if you want to know verses 5 or 6 all the way, the end of 5, all the way through 9 are kind of more of Abram's travels there. But there's a famine in the land as verse 10 starts. So in this promise, there's immediately a problem. Now there's a famine in the land, so Abram went down to Egypt to sojourn there, for the famine was severe in the land. When he was about to enter Egypt, he said to Sarai, his wife, "I know that you are a woman beautiful in appearance." So far, so good. "When the Egyptians see you, they will say, 'This is his wife.' Then they will kill me, but they will let you live. Say you are my sister, that it may go well with me because of you, and that my life may be spared for your sake." Big ask by Abram here, okay? But here's his plan. They don't even get to Egypt. He acknowledges, listen, you're seriously attractive, and everybody knows that you're attractive. Abram's 75, so she's probably 75, but she's attractive, right? Okay, she's attractive here. So here we have this moment where the Egyptians are going to acknowledge it. Abram says, I know that they're going to acknowledge it. What's going to happen is they're going to kill me, and then they're going to take you. Let's skip the killing me part and just give you to them, right? That's the plan. This is the preface into the plan. Well, so we see how the plan unfolds, and it goes exactly how Abram had hoped. When Abram entered Egypt, the Egyptians saw that the woman was very beautiful. And when the princes of Pharaoh saw her, they praised her to Pharaoh. Have you seen Abram's wife? Have you seen her? This is what it looks like. So she's called. And the woman was taken into Pharaoh's house, verse 16. And for her sake, he dealt well with Abram. And he had sheep and oxen, male donkeys, male servants, female donkeys, and camels. Okay, so Abram definitely gets the better end of this deal. Now his wife Sarai is with Pharaoh. So if we can read verses 10 through 16 for Abram and his plan and what happens, then verses 17 through 20 is God stepping in. This is what happens in verse 17. But the Lord afflicted Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abraham's wife. So Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this that you have done to me? Why did you not tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say she is my sister so that I would take her as my wife? Now then, here is your wife, take her and go. And Pharaoh gave men orders concerning her, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. Okay, so we read this kind of account, few things to acknowledge. Abraham does lie. Number two, he gives his wife to another man. And this is tricky because you could accuse, in some ways, this has been known as like Abraham is prostituting his wife. Someone says it's not exactly right in the context of the culture at the time. But the reality is if I told my wife Candace, I said, hey, listen, here's this guy's going to pay me a lot of money. Can you go be with him? By intents and purposes, that would be prostitution. I would be a pimp in that moment, pimping out my wife. I'm not trying to say that to be funny, just genuinely, that's what that would be. And so we're not meant to read this story, and we know we're not meant to read this story as Abraham does something good here because God steps in. God steps in, he provides plagues, maybe foreshadowing for the book of Exodus. But what we see is that's not right, and God steps in from verses 17 through 20. That's story 2. We'll come back to it. Story 3 involves Lot, chapter 13, verse 1. So, Abram went up from Egypt, he and his wife, and all that he had, and Lot with him into Negeb. Verse 2, now Abram was very rich, so some of that blessing is starting to roll itself out, in livestock, in silver, and in gold, and he sojourned from Negeb as far as Bethel to the place where where his tent had been at the beginning. So he goes full circle from what we saw in chapter 12, between Bethel and Ai, back in the promised land areas is what we can know that to be. Verse 4, to that place where he had made an altar at the first, that's in chapter 12, verse 7. And there Abram called upon the name of the Lord, and Lot, who was with Abraham, also had flocks and herdsmen and tents. Verse 6, so that the land could not support both of them dwelling together, for their possessions were so great that they could not dwell together. And there was strife between the herdsmen of Abraham's livestock and the herdsmen of Lot's livestock. At the time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in the land. Okay, so few things I want you to notice so that the land could not support both of them dwelling there immediately as Abraham seems to be blessed. His family seems to be blessed, but there's a problem with that. They're kind of squished in this land, and so they need to figure out a problem. Their herdsmen are arguing on what the best grass is. So Abraham and Lot, as they've just grown, they need to separate. So again, here's the problem, just like in the section before. Again, Abraham has a solution. The Lord is here in this, and we see it in verse 8. Then Abraham said to Lot, let there be no strife between you and me, between our herdsmen, between your herdsmen and my herdsmen, for we are kinsmen. It is not the whole land before you. Separate yourself from me. If you take the left hand, then I will go to the right. If you take the right hand, then I will go to the left. And Lot lifted up his eyes, saw that the Jordan Valley was well watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, like the land of Egypt in the direction of Zorah. That was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself all the valley, the Jordan Valley, and Lot journeyed east. Thus they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, while Lot settled among the cities of the valley and moved his tent as far as Sodom. Verse 13 gives us a detail. Now the men of Sodom were wicked, great sinners against the Lord. So essentially Abram brings Lot and says, hey, listen, check it out. You go this way, I'll go this way. If you go this way, I'll go this way. So Lot chooses to go east, fine, I'll go west. That's how they settle it. We shouldn't be fighting. And some of this is great, even acknowledging as an example of conflict resolution. You could say this, be humble in this and cordial. Verse 14, the Lord said to Abram after Lot had separated. So what did we find in the last section of Scripture? We saw the story, and then God intercedes in the same way now. Verse 14, God enters in. He has this conversation with Abram. The Lord said to Abram, after Lot had separated from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward and eastward and westward. For all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. Verse 16, for I will take your offspring as the dust, for I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that no one could count the dust of the earth. Your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it to you. Verse 18, so Abram moved his tents and came and settled into the oaks of Mamre, which are at Hebron, and there he built an altar to the Lord. Now, before we unpack the second part, if you could, look back at verse 7 of chapter 13. It gives this kind of inconspicuous detail that only the original readers would have known about. At this time, the Canaanites and the Perizzites were dwelling in that land. So that would be like a marker in time. Also, if you can, notice verse 10. There's another marker there. It's in parentheses this time. This was before the Lord destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. This would be like, if you grew up in Phoenix like I did, and we learn the history of the United States, we learn it, but honestly, it's on the other side of the country. There's not a lot of, pressure points for us. We don't have points of reference for us. But if you grew up in Boston or in Washington, D.C., and you learn the history of the United States, you quite literally grew up around the history you know, okay? So it's hard for us because we're reading this now in such a way that we're so removed. But throughout this process of unpacking these stories, Moses is giving the people these details. Remember, this is where they were. This was before Sodom and Gomorrah was destroyed. There's these references. And the reason that matters is you can notice it says, all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. It's not just by coincidence that it is the very land that is before them and the people that are originally reading it that text is referring to at the end of verse 15. They know this story. It's talking about them. And so God doubles down on his promise, which might have seemed so far to them in chapter 12, but just as a reminder, there are these points of reference. I'm talking about you. This is you. And so they know these places. They experience these places. It's for these people, okay? And so he goes on to build an altar there. He ends back up right where he started. That's story 3. Story 4 also includes Lot. Chapter 14. We're almost done with this. Let's keep processing. Let me summarize verses 1 through 9 of chapter 14 briefly. So there essentially are 9 kingdoms, okay? 4 kingdoms are very strong. They're under, you can see it there if you're looking at verse 1 through 9, Chedorlaomer. I don't know how you want to pronounce that name, but Chedorlaomer is the king of these 4 kingdoms, and they're strong kingdoms. Well, there's another 5 kingdoms that exist, and the 5 kingdoms are not as strong. The 4 kingdoms are in the Syria area. We'll call them the eastern kingdoms. The other 5 kingdoms we're going to just call them the western kingdoms, kind of more southern. But the western kingdoms, they're on this other side. They're weaker, but they're tired of being under Chedorlaomer, okay? And so what they do is, after 12 years of being under his subjugation, in the 13th year, they say, we're done with this. We want out. And in the 14th year, he goes, okay, well, let's go to war. And so it seems like suddenly, randomly, there are 9 kingdoms, 5 and 4, going to battle. Well, here's what happens. The 5 smaller kingdoms, the weaker kingdoms, end up winning this battle. They push back the 4 kingdoms. And as they push back the 4 kingdoms, they're in retreat. And so we pick up the story in verse 10. Now the valley of Siddim was full of bitumen pits. And as the kings of Sodom and Gomorrah fled, some fell into them, and the rest fled into the hill country. So the enemy took all the possessions of Sodom and Gomorrah and all their provisions and went their way. Now, immediately, we know back in chapter 13, something about Sodom and Gomorrah. There was a detail in Sodom and Gomorrah. What was the detail? It was that Lot was there. So we have this story which seems insignificant, but it's telling this battle because in a minute, it's going to involve Lot. Because as these kingdoms are being pushed back, they're in retreat. And what happens is there's these provisions that are taken by the winning kingdoms. And what happens is they take Lot. They take Lot and all this stuff. So we can see in Sodom and Gomorrah, they take him. They also, verse 12, they also took Lot, the son of Abram's brother, who was dwelling in Sodom, and his possessions, and went their way. Well, here's what happens in verse 13. Then one of them who escaped came and told Abram, the Hebrew, who was living in the oaks of Mamre, the Amorite, brother of Eshcol and of Anar. These were allies of Abram. Verse 14, when Abram heard that his kinsmen had been taken captive, he led forth his trained men born in his house, 318 of them, went in pursuit as far as Dan. And he divided his forces against them by night, he and his servants, and defeated them and pursued them to Hobo, I don't want to say hobo there, but it's almost what it says, north of Damascus. Verse 16, then he brought back all the possessions, and also brought back his kinsman Lot with his possessions and the women and the people. So Abram goes with 318 of his men, maybe his finest men. We're led to believe, we don't know for sure, but I'm assuming there's more men involved. He ends up getting back Lot. They conquer those guys, and he brings back the people. Like, great. This is an awesome story. Okay, let's stop for a second. So we've read of our stories. We've read 4 of our 5 stories so far. And thus far, it's been very chaotic. I mean, it's just a lot of stuff going on. And it's not just a lot of stuff. It doesn't seem to be going that well. I mean, we're left, as I said, at the end of chapter 11, we're left with this question on our mind. God, what's the plan? With all these nations, what are you planning on doing to help this situation? Genesis 3 broke things, and since then, things have not been right. What's your plan? And his answer in chapter 12 was Abram. Abram is the answer. So we go back full circle where I started. That's where we get to, okay? Abram's the answer. Well, now we've read chapters 12, 13, and 14. We have another question for God, and it's, are you sure? Are you sure that's the answer? Because I'm reading a list of things here. Not only are the nations so far not that blessed, or it doesn't seem like, but Egypt is actually cursed, maybe temporarily, or at least Pharaoh and his people there are cursed. Abram almost loses his wife, which is going to be really important for the descendant parts of the promise. There's a 50-50 shot with Lot. I mean, you're an original reader, and you're reading, please don't choose the land, please don't choose the promised land, right? And Lot chooses this direction. All this thing is up in air. And then finally, Abraham's family, who is to be blessed, they're actually being held into captivity, and Abram has to go and rescue them. So it feels like it's chaotic. It feels like this is not the right plan as a holistic way of understanding the totality of these 3 chapters together. Now, I get it. There are things we can learn in these individual stories. I'm not denying that. But if you take the macro level for a second, this whole promise by God seems fragile. I mean, let's call it what it is. You guys, it's 1 heartbeat away for Abraham. Now, could God use somebody else at that time? Sure. I don't deny that. But honestly, the promise was with Abram. And what if in this battle an arrow hits him? I mean, we're talking, there is a fragility to this promise we've got to acknowledge. And I think the reason that matters is, if you can, draw your attention again to verse 13. And this feels, again, insignificant, but I think it's a cue for something. It says, then the one who escaped came and told, here it is, Abram, and it gives a defining characteristic about Abram, doesn't it? Told Abram the Hebrew. Now, check this out. In 1625, there were people living somewhere in this land, maybe Native American. Somebody was living in the state of Arizona, but it wasn't called Arizona. Now, when we go back, do we call them Arizonans, right? Well, no, because we're called Arizonans right now because we live in Arizona. We're called Arizonans. Well, there is no the Hebrews when Abram is experiencing all this. There isn't any Hebrews, but the original readers were. They understand that. That as Moses is telling the story, it's something to cue in their mind. Wait a minute. Abram, that's right. The Hebrew, that's right. This is our story. And suddenly the fragility of all of this comes to, but God, amidst all of this chaos where he's trying to give his wife away and Lot is held captive and there's not enough room in the land, all these pieces as they move around, we are reminded that God is with his people, but more so, it's God who's ultimately carrying the hope of the nations. It's not about Abraham. It's not about Sarah. It's not about Lot. It's the central figure is God, that God is doing something. And what we're led to believe after 3 chapters of this is, as Spurgeon says, God doesn't need your strength. He has plenty of that. He needs your weakness. He doesn't need your strength. And what we know as the story goes on, that's God's MO. From Moses, he doesn't need Moses' strength. He needs his weakness. He doesn't call upon Gideon and his men. He actually decreases the amount of men in the army. I'm reading 1 Samuel right now, and everything that makes Saul king, all the ways that he would be pompous and where he goes awry, starts with the fact that he's the greatest in the land, but he fails. The ultimate story ends on David, who is known as being the weakest even in his own family. And so what we have in front of us is God is carrying the story along. He's doing this. And so let me just kind of show the cards. This is still true today. God's promise in Abraham, which is an arrow to the heart away, Abraham is fragile, but the promise of the nations is so big in this very fragile vessel. And that's exactly actually what 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7 says. I think the point of all this, right, is this very big, perfect God is carrying along small and flawed people, because 2 Corinthians chapter 4, verse 7 says this about you and I. But we have this treasure. The treasure, you can go back and read verses 1 through 6, is the gospel of Jesus Christ. We, right now, have this treasure in jars of clay. Your jar of clay in this verse. We are the jars of clay, fragile. How fragile is a jar of clay? Like if I had it right now and I just dropped it by accident, it would shatter. We have the hope of the world in jars of clay. Why? Well, we're not left to guess. At the back half of verse 7 tells us why. You want to know why? To show that the surpassing power belongs to God and not to us. That's why. And so when we read this story and we read this chaos, we recognize God is really, really big. God has a plan. God has this under control. Even though it feels like it's chaotic and it's going to fail, God's doing something. And we're reminded of this in our fifth story. If you can, draw your attention to the last story in verse 17. Now, 21 through 24 is a kind of a bow on that whole thing with the kings, right? So Abram's going to keep his integrity. He's not going to keep the loot from the plunder and all that, and so he gives it back and he keeps his integrity. But it's verses 17 through 20 that are talked about in the rest of Scripture. Not Lot and the separation of land, not Sarai and the whole deal with Egypt, not that, but it's verses 17 through 20. There has been more ink spilled on verses 17 through 20 than, I would say honestly, from chapter 10 all the way probably to at least chapter 22 to 23. I mean, there's been so much ink spilled on this small encounter, and if you're new to Christianity, you're going to wonder why. And this is where we get into, because there's some actually really, really deep theology here. Here it is, what feels like an insignificant story. After his return, this is Abram, from the defeat of Chedorlaomer, and the kings who are with him, the kings of Sodom went out to meet him in the valley of Sheva, that is the king's valley. Verse 18, here it is, and Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought out bread and wine. He was a priest of God Most High. And he blessed him and said, Blessed be Abram by God Most High, possessor of heaven and earth. And blessed be God Most High, who has delivered your enemies into your hand. And Abram gave him a tenth of everything. Now, if you're just reading through the Bible in the year, my guess is you're already through Genesis at this point. You already read this account. You were like, I don't know what that story was. That's random. There's randomly, I mean, you could see the account of it. There's this Melchizedek character who's the king of Salem, but he's also a priest of the Most High God. Then he blesses Abraham, and then Abraham gives him a tithe. That's it. Now, that feels odd. It feels strange, but the Bible is going to point back to this. If you can, you could turn to Psalm 110. In Psalm 110, it's a psalm on the coming Messiah. And the coming Messiah is all these prophecies of how the Father's going to use. Famously, it's known, and the Lord said to my Lord. It's this kind of Trinitarian conversation we're led into, sit at my right hand. But it's even more than that. There are other things that are said about the coming Messiah. So the Jewish people know about this coming Messiah, and they're reading Psalm 110. They're waiting for God to make things right. He has a promise for the nations. The Lord said to my Lord, sit at my right hand until I make your enemies your footstool. The Lord sends forth from Zion your mighty scepter. Rule in the midst of your enemies. Yes, Messiah. Come, Messiah. Yes. Your people will offer themselves freely. And on the day of your power, in holy garments from the womb of the morning, the dew of your youth will be yours. Look at verse 5. The Lord is at your right hand. He will shatter kings on the day of his wrath. He will execute judgment among the nations, filling them with corpses. He shall shatter chiefs over the wide earth. He will drink from the brook by the way. Therefore, he will lift up his head. This is this prophecy about this coming Messiah. Now, you are a Jew at this time. You're reading this about this coming Messiah, and we skipped over verse 4 intentionally. One of the things that are said about this Messiah is verse 4, the Lord has sworn, and he will not change his mind. Here it is, you are a priest forever after the order of Melchizedek. What? Now, I'm a Jew going through this in Torah class, and I'm going, I know Melchizedek. He was randomly mentioned in Genesis 14. So the Messiah is going to be tied in his priesthood to the same priesthood that Melchizedek had? Well, that's confusing because we only know of one priesthood. It's the Levites. There's 12 tribes, and there's one of the tribes is the Levites. So who's this whole Messiah and Melchizedek thing? And so now here's the great news. You live in a time in history where God has revealed the totality of his word. And so now you get with 2020 insight to see what's going on with all of this, because the writer of Hebrews comes along and he's talking about Jesus being a priest. And then by talking about Jesus being a priest, he has to talk about Melchizedek. So if you can, go to Hebrews chapter 7, the last passage. So it's not just that Melchizedek is tied to the Messiah, or the Messiah is tied to Melchizedek, the Melchizedek priesthood, but the first 3 verses give us the details of the story we just read. Verse 1 of Hebrews chapter 7 says, "For this Melchizedek, king of Salem, priest of the Most High God, met Abraham, returning from the slaughter of the kings, and blessed him." We know that story. We just read it. "And to him, Abram," dang it, getting these back and forth confused. "And to him, Abraham apportioned a 10th part of everything." We just read that story. "He is first, by translation of his name, king of righteousness." He's talking about the definition of his name. "And he's also king of Salem," that is, king of peace. "He is without father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life, but resembling the Son of God, he continues a priest forever." Now, I said the first part of this is going to be a lot of Bible, okay? But the second part was going to be a lot of doctrine, a lot of theology. And I know a lot of you haven't spent a lot of time understanding Melchizedek, and maybe this feels like a seminary class. But if we can, just track with me for a second, okay? Slow down. When we go through verses 1 through 3, it gives us insight as to why that story back in Genesis 14 wasn't so random. But not only that, Melchizedek himself isn't so random. We're reading the story, and it feels like Melchizedek came out of nowhere. I mean, who's this Melchizedek figure? How is he a priest? If he's a priest of the Most High God, why haven't we heard of him already? Well, Hebrews tells us he's without a father or mother or genealogy, having neither beginning of days nor end of life. So there's something special. Now, as a side note, people have argued at great length. In my undergrad, I had to write a paper on this, and my professor made me make a decision, what is called a Christophany. Is this Jesus quite literally appearing in Genesis 14, or is he an archetype, a foreshadowing? That right now, we don't need to solve that. We just need to know, in some level, in Hebrews, the writer of Hebrews is talking about Jesus as a priest, and now he's talking about Jesus being tied to Melchizedek. And the first 3 verses gave us the details of the story we already know. But here it is. In verses 4 through 10, he explains everything. It says, "So how great this man was, to whom Abraham, the patriarch, gave a 10th of the spoils. And those descendants of Levi who receive the priestly office have a commandment in the law to take tithes from the people, that is, from their brothers." So we talked about the tithes of all the 11 tribes go to the Levites, because that's the one tribe that is priests. "Though these also descended from Abraham." Verse 6, "But this man who does not have his descent from them received tithes from Abraham, and blessed him who had the promises." Verse 7, "Is beyond disputes that the inferior is blessed by the superior. In the one case, tithes are received by mortal men, but in the other case, by one of whom it is testified that he lives. One might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor when Melchizedek met him." A lot going on there. Let's do it, okay? To sum up what's happening, you need to understand the point of why the author of Hebrews is bringing up Melchizedek. And the premise, of all that, foundation of that is built on a question. Here's the question. Did Jesus offer himself as a sacrifice as a priest? So a priest has to come in, offer a sacrifice. Was Jesus both priest and sacrifice? And the answer is yes, he was. Now, if he's going to fulfill the Old Testament law, to be able to be a priest, he has to be from the tribe of Levi. That's the rules. So for him to fulfill this and do this right, he has to be from the tribe of Levi. But there's a problem. He's not. He's from the tribe of Judah. And so now he offers a sacrifice, and by technicality, his sacrifice should be null and void. So how is Jesus' sacrifice not null and void? How does it count? Well, the writer of Hebrews in chapter 7 just explained. Because Jesus, though not part of the tribe of Levi, comes from the tribe of Judah, is part of a priestly order that is greater than the Levites, in that Abraham is greater than the Levites, and Melchizedek is greater than Abraham. And he makes 2 very simple points that you can see here. First, in verse 7, we can see that we know this because Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Verse 7 is abundantly clear. It's apparently beyond dispute. It is beyond dispute that the inferior is blessed by the superior, meaning Abraham would bless his children, or his children's children's children, in this case the Levites, but Melchizedek blesses Abraham. That means Melchizedek is even greater than Abraham. Furthermore, all the other tribes give to the tribe of Levi a tithe. Why? Because they are the priests for them. But we can see in verses 9 and 10, one might even say that Levi himself, who receives tithes, paid tithes through Abraham, for he was still in the loins of his ancestor, and Melchizedek met him. So you could argue, it is the case, that Melchizedek is a priesthood greater, bigger, stronger before and after the tribe of Levi, because he's the one who blesses, and not only that, Abraham pays up the tithe to Melchizedek in the same way the Levites are receiving tithe from their kindred. And so now suddenly all the pieces go together, because at the end of 7 and the beginning of 8, we see that the people of the Levi tribe, who are the priests, it had an ending. They couldn't keep offering sacrifices because their sacrifices were faulty, and them as a priesthood, they're not perfect. They're not going to live forever. So we need a priesthood that's bigger and longer and faster, not faster, well, maybe stronger and more eternal than the Levite priesthood. And we have it. There's a priesthood that is greater. It's called the Melchizedek priesthood. That's the priesthood that Jesus belongs to. And so now we get to tie it all together. In the middle of this chaos, we are reminded that it feels like everything is so fragile, Lord, and yet embedded in these 3 chapters, God is reminding us that he's doing something. That even in Abraham's faults and failures, and even in his great times of faith, it's not about Abraham. Even in his descendants, their faults and failures, and in their faith, it's not about his descendants. It's not about the land, it's about God. And God in his goodness is giving us this story, this narrative. It all starts with God. God is holding the promise together. And so when we are asked at the end of chapter 11, Lord, what's the plan for all of the nations? There's so much brokenness. What's the plan? And I read chapters 12, 13, 14. I go, surely this man cannot be the plan. And he goes, he's not. The hope for the nations is Jesus. The hope for the nations is a priesthood beyond the priesthood I will give you in the future. The hope for the nations is my son. Let's pray.